Well, it's been a pretty rough 10 days. I came down with pneumonia about 10 days ago and just had me completely horizontal for 6 straight days. And probably the second or maybe third most miserable I've ever been in my life before because of a sickness. And during those times, when I can't really sleep and have nothing to do but lay there, I find myself thinking quite a lot. And I found myself pondering a topic that I've thought about many times before and wanted to share at some point on this YouTube video, or YouTube channel, but thought maybe it would be the time and jotted down some notes and tried to put some thoughts together in an organized way. And so this is an attempt to do just that. The one thing that's really interesting when you're sick and you don't have the energy to maintain the normal level of communication that you do is you find yourself talking more slowly, being more precise with your words, and more often than not expressing really what you mean. And I had some really wonderful conversations with my children as I started to recover a little bit, where they would come and lay with me and we would talk. And I found myself being much more articulate and much more purposeful with my words and not stumbling over them. Sometimes we can speak at such a pace where it feels easier to say the wrong sentence once or twice and then correct it with the third than it is to just take the time and say that third sentence the way we initially intended. And anyhow, so this video is about a topic that I've been thinking about for a little over 20 years, maybe more, and that is how we can integrate integrity and honesty into our speech in ways that we may have not thought of before. And start with a simple example from my childhood. When I was growing up, my mother would often correct me and point out to me that something I was describing as a need was really a want. And this is probably not a unique experience. I think a lot of parents are reminding children, it's that new Lego set is not a need, honey, that's a want. Um, Playing with your friends is not a need, that's a want. And she did it quite a lot. And I think eventually, maybe my sister and I even would kind of do it to each other. I see that in my own children where they will correct one another. And Peter, that's not a need, that's a want. And as I've gotten older, I've seen the value in that exercise. And I've also seen the human tendency to want to shift things into the need category because it makes it so much easier to justify our pursuit of them. So, as an example, if you were to say, I need a new car versus I'd like a new car, then it's much easier to set aside thoughts of I can't afford one, or money would be spent elsewhere, better spent elsewhere. And so you just pursue it under this guise of it being a need, just a non negotiable. And the first area in my life where I started recognizing this myself was, I think, roughly when I was around 16. And I realized that the phrase, I don't have time for this or that, was very common in my peer group. Everyone said, like, oh, I don't have time for that. And I kind of thought about how, well, we actually all have the same amount of time. We all have 24 hours a day. And I could see how some of my friends were choosing to use their time in an unproductive, unfruitful way. And that put them in a position where they then didn't have time for other things. But they had more or less just trapped themselves. And I made a conscious effort to not use the phrase, I don't have time for an activity or a hobby or whatever. And I really regularly started saying to people, I don't make time for that. And I found that it was actually a little bit difficult to regularly use slightly more precise and accurate language than my peers were using and my community around me was using. And it also, every time I used that sentence, there was like this little teeny tiny prick in my own conscience and perhaps in the consciences of others, where I was sort of pricking my own conscience and saying, like, yeah, you could have time for that if it were a good and noble thing, but you're choosing not to. Or if it were a not so noble thing that I was choosing not to take part in, like maybe watching a certain TV series, then it was also this little prick in my conscience, like you're making a choice here, like you're choosing not to watch this, and maybe you're proud of that choice, and that's fine. But it was also this little tiny step of assertiveness and sort of planting a flag to say, I'm in control of my time. God's given me 24 hours a day, and I can choose to use them to sleep or play or work or be kind or be unkind. And I really think it made a meaningful difference in the way that I spoke to people. And it's hard to say, but I think that that type of precision that I was practicing with I don't have time versus I don't make time was spilling over into other areas. And I think the precision of my language greatly was sharpened when I moved to Germany. I moved there without speaking the language at all. I left having passed the second highest fluency certification in the country, which is C1, C1. And I learned a lot. And I would sit down with my German teacher and I would ask her, what is the difference between, in German, but it was like, what was the difference between like assume, presume, guess, conclude? What was the difference between assess, estimate, analyze, observe, discern? And we would sit down and we would dice up these words into their finer meanings. And then it was, of course, my aim to use those words appropriately. And one of the things that I saw in Germany, and there's two examples of this, is how not only was I misusing phrases like I don't have time versus I don't make time, but I was really completely misusing words. And one great example of that was, and it helps that the Germans are quite direct. Germans are a bit more blunt and brash than Americans are. They don't beat around the bush as much. And so that attitude combined with what I'm about to describe, I think was really enlightening. But I said to my German teacher one time, I said, Anya, I have a request for you, but before I ask it, I want you to know that it's okay if you say no. And so that sounded something like this. Anja, ich habe eine Bitte an dich, aber bevor ich frage, musst du wissen, du darfst Nein sagen. And she, as a German teacher, classically was like, James, it's a request. Of course I'm allowed to say no. My right to say no is always on the table when it comes to requests. And I kind of felt like, oh yeah, of course, that's silly. And then I asked her the question. And what I realized later was that what I was really trying to say to her is that I have a request for you, and if you deny me my request, I won't be sour about it. And then, of course, that begs the question, well, why did I give that disclaimer? That makes it sound like if she, in other circumstances when I haven't given that disclaimer, I'm essentially setting the person up to say, if you don't give me what I want, I'm going to be sour with you. And that thought was shortly thereafter really reinforced at a deep level. There was a guy, probably in his late 50s. His name was Bant. We knew him from church, and he was at our house. And he was this really rough, tough, gruff, sort of, construction contractor grade type guy. And I don't mean that as a compliment or an insult, only to describe who he was. I admired him greatly, actually, and he had a lot of wisdom that was kind of shrouded in, sort of rough clothing. But one of the things he said to me is, he said, James, Before I go to someone with a request or a question, I take time to prepare myself for either of the two answers. And I try and resist going and asking until I am mature enough to accept either answer. So if I ask my friend to borrow his table saw, let's say, and I've basically assumed that he's going to say yes, there's no reason for him to say no. He has a table saw. He knows I take good care of it. He knows I'll return it. He knows I'll replace it if something breaks. And so he goes to his friend and says, "Can I borrow your table saw?" Well, if the friend says no, and my friend Bant finds that unacceptable and is now sour or upset with this person, then Bant has acted immaturely. And so he was explaining to me how he tries to not approach someone until he's ready for either answer. He's ready to continue the relationship with sort of the same vim and vigor, whether the person approves or denies his request. And then he said something to me that just really blew me away. He said, if you're not in the position to accept either of your friend's answers, then you've not gone to him with a request. You've gone to him with a demand. You've demanded something of him, and you've left him no choice. left him no choice but to provide you one answer. Otherwise, you're going to unleash consequences on him. That was 10 years ago, and that has stuck with me regularly as I have gone to people and approached them and recognized that I haven't always gone with requests. Sometimes I've gone with demands or with extremely high expectations, unspoken. And I think that as you become a parent and as you teach your children, you'll you'll pick up on this maybe a little bit easier because children are quite quick to punish you if you don't give them what you want. Mommy, can I have a slice of cake? No, well, you're a jerk, mommy. So then it's like, wow, that was really obvious, but it's less obvious as we do it as adults. And I think that there are a lot of phrases in our vocabulary that essentially are deceitful. A simple example would be also, I no longer say I can't afford something. I mean, there are things that I truly can't afford, but most of the time when we use the phrase I can't afford something, what we're really saying is that's not how I spend my money. I don't direct my money towards, fancy restaurants or nice clothes. Instead, I direct my money to the newest iPhone or table saw. And what's very funny is when you start to see people say, I can't afford something, when they say, like, oh, I can't afford that, you only have to look slightly left or slightly right to see something equally, if not more expensive in their life that they obviously are choosing to prioritize over that thing, which of course is totally fine. There's no reason that people need to buy the same table saw that I have or buy the same fancy clothing that I have or whatever. But when you identify these things in your life, you realize that sort of hiding behind this language is something that actually needs to be addressed, whether it's like weakness and a lack of boldness or cowardice, or something like that. And part of the reason I brought this up was the guy I'm giving my lathe to was going to come over the day before Thanksgiving, and we are gonna go get lunch, and then we are gonna load it up, and I was gonna send it off to him, and I was feeling absolutely atrocious, and I had to cancel, and that made me very sad because I like to keep the commitments that I've made. I don't like changing plans. I don't like disappointing people, and I suspected that he was excited to get the lathe before Thanksgiving and spend some time over the break using it. And this next part I think is because I was sick and I was laying there and I had nothing to do but think. But I thought about all of the different ways that I could cancel. I could say I need to cancel, or I have to cancel, or I must cancel. And in all three of those cases, I'm shifting the responsibility of my choice off of myself. And I'm basically saying, like, hey, look, I have no choice. I must, right? Almost as if I was given an order. And then I thought how I could say, I'm canceling, hey, friend, I don't feel well. I'm canceling our plans. And then I thought about how even there's a small buffer if you put it into the future tense. Like if you say, I'm canceling our lunch today, that's actually somewhat stronger than I'm going to cancel our lunch today. It almost gives that person one last chance to kind of hit the ping pong ball back into your court and say, like, oh, have you considered? And it's almost like saying, I'm gonna let you in on the comfort. I'm gonna tell you what I'm about to do rather than tell you what I've just done. And I found all of that to be sorry. I found all of that to be quite interesting as I kind of churned all of that up. And so one thing I want to do more and more in my life is saturate my speech, my verbs, my adjectives. I want to saturate my speech in truth and integrity. And I think it comes at a cost. It comes at a slight cost of being really cognizant of what you're saying. And I think it even comes at an unknown cost to your relationships because I think somehow it's a softer blow when you say, like, hey, I have to cancel versus I'm canceling. But I also think deep down we all know that you don't have to cancel. You just feel so terrible that you don't want to, pack up a lathe while feeling this way, which is understandable. But I think we all sort of know that we're using this language that is sometimes inherently dishonest. And so I wanted to share that with the world, with my YouTube channel. This YouTube channel has never been just about engines and tools. I have some of these things that feel important and feel like they're worth sharing. And this is one of the mechanisms through which I share them. So have a great day. Watch your speech. Let it be full of integrity and take responsibility for your choices. They're your choices. They belong to you. You get to make them. Take care.